Our second reading this morning is from the book of Hebrews, chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, and then chapter 2, verses 5 through 12. Long ago, God spoke to our ancestors in many and various ways by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by a Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom he also created the worlds. He is the reflection of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's very being. And he sustains all things in his powerful word. When he made purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to the angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. Now, God did not subject this coming world about which we are speaking to angels, but someone has testified, "What are human beings that you are mindful of them, or mortals that you care for them? You have made them for a little while lower than the angels. You have crowned them with glory and honor, subjecting all things under their feet." Now, in subjecting all things to them, God left nothing outside their control. As it is, we do not yet see everything in subjection to them, but we do see Jesus, who for a little while was made lower than the angels, now crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. It was fitting that God, for whom and through whom all things exist, in bringing many children to glory, should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through sufferings. For the one who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one Father. For this reason, Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters, saying, "I will proclaim your name to my brothers and sisters. In the midst of the congregation, I will praise you." So, on this World Communion Sunday, when we celebrate the gifts of other cultures, we have been enriched by their songs and their prayers in our worship this morning. And we also share with the Christians around the world, as together later we will share in the gift of bread and wine on this day. So, is there a question in these two readings from the book of Psalms and from the book of Hebrews for us to consider this morning? I think the question is, what are human beings that God is mindful of us, mortals, that God cares for us? Last week, I noted the ongoing racism in our land as we considered Reconciliation Sunday. It was a difficult sermon to preach, and I expect it was a difficult one to hear. For no one likes to hear that we continue to be stained by racism's ugliness. But we must recognize that humans have used other humans, as well as animals and the earth, in ways that do not reflect God's glory, nor have the exact imprint of God's being. Being human is a difficult and complex assignment, and I would suggest that a good deal of that complexity and difficulty of being human is based on our inability to fully be able to live into being reflections of God's glory and imprinted with God's being. We live in a world where evil swirls around like a tornadic force, doing violence to our souls and destroying the fabric of the divine common good which underlies our very existence. Truthfully, it has always been so, but I think we recognize it more readily now than before, in part because of greater access to what is going on in and around the world. At the heart of such discouragement is our inability to recognize in the reports and news we receive even an inkling that it is in and through God that these things, actually all things, exist. It is just too ugly out there and at times in here to think that God has anything to do with the mess we experience on a daily basis. Sometimes it's even hard to remember that God is walking with us and helping to bear our burdens and encouraging us to live full, happy, holy lives. I wonder what might have been going on in the psalmist's world when he or she penned what we know as Psalm 8. It is difficult to imagine that the writer was deluged with the stuff of our lives. If he or she was, how could they produce such a wonderfully thoughtful and positive poem and praise of thanksgiving? I must confess that it is not often that I could write something so positive and uplifting. Because as I look out in this world, it's not easy to look around and recognize God's glory in the world today. It's not easy to look at what we are doing to the planet and see the Creator's handiwork. It's not easy to look at our neighbors and see the imprint of God. It's not easy to look at today's politics and politicians and see angelic-like countenance, crowned with honor and glory. It's not easy to look in the mirror and see the face of Jesus Christ looking back at us. If there was ever a time when human beings were living out the message of this psalm, it hardly feels like it today. Perhaps we aren't looking in the right places. When was the last time that any of us really looked at the heavens? Really looked at the heavens and marveled at God's handiwork? When did we last see a full moon and see God's face in that moon rather than thinking about all the crazies who would be coming out? When was the last time that we recognized that in comparison to the majesty and glory of creation, human beings play but a tiny role? It seems to me that the psalmist brings together two very important themes: humility and belonging. Here, humility is gained when comparing the vastness of space, where the moon and stars are suspended, comparing that with the smallness of humanity. In a book I've been reading, it says that there were 9 universes that were known by astrologers, astronomers, 35 years ago. Today there are more than 300. What are we in comparison to the vastness of God's beautiful creation? For the psalmist, gazing into the night skies was a window, an icon through which to experience God in all of God's divine supremacy. This visitation carried with it the full awareness that we are utterly insignificant in the great order of the universe. But the psalmist knows that this insignificant is only one small part of a far greater story. You see, while in one breath the psalmist reminds us of the majesty and glory of God's creation, in the very next breath he or she recognizes in some place deep within the Spirit that humans are also, at the very same time, created just a little lower than God in one translation, or just a little lower than the angels in another. And that human beings, you and I, you and me, are crowned with honor and with glory. That while we can stand outside of creation and bemoan our fate, we actually belong within creation, intricate and deeply connected, not just to one another as human beings, but rather connected with all of creation. As the psalmist writes, with sheep and oxen, the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, and the fish of the sea. Oh Lord, how wondrous is your majesty in all the earth. For the writer of Hebrews, this commingling of humility and belonging is best reflected in Jesus Christ, who humbled himself in order to belong with us and for us to belong with him, in order that God might have a window through which to view humanity, and that humanity might have a window through which to view God. And this happens when we come to the realization that all of us, this world around, are to be recognized and honored as brothers and sisters. Jesus says, I'm proud to call them brothers and sisters, all of us children of God. A God who creates and redeems, a God who recreates and forgives. This morning we have sung songs and prayed prayers from our brothers and sisters around the world. We sang with the Dutch and the Latin Americans. We've prayed with sisters and brothers from Asia and New Zealand. Before we are done today, we will have sung with our Spanish and Jamaican families, been blessed with an Irish blessing, and sent out with a Welsh tune. The majesty and glory of God's name and God's wondrous creation and the creative arts that God has put inside the human, just a little bit less creative than God. Just a little bit, the writer says. Perhaps most important of all, we will sit at Christ's table, sharing the bread of life and the joyful cup of forgiveness with Christians far and near. We do so in profound humility, that we come as guests invited, all of us, everywhere the same. Not because we are worthy, but because God is worthy. And in Christ, We are brothers and sisters, one with another. And we will hear those words of promise. My life broken, my life shed for you. We join with this one great family of love in praising the one to whom we all belong. There are times when it is difficult to see and claim our belonging. There are, after all, people with whom we don't even want to be associated with, let alone call brothers and sisters. There are times when we ourselves don't feel worthy. There are times when we want to put away our humility and put on a cloak of hostility. There are times when we want to snarl and point our fingers, when we want to give in to such anger and isolate ourselves from them, whoever them is. But God in Christ doesn't just honor some, doesn't create some more equal than others, doesn't judge others' sin more harshly than our own. God in Jesus Christ offers forgiveness to us all and the family to belong to if we will but receive and accept the gift. Still, I would suggest we need to spend more time with the night skies. We need to look for the reflection of God's glory and the imprint of God's very being in everyone we encounter, everywhere we look. We need to look in the mirror and see Jesus looking back at us. We need to recognize that Jesus is as much for them as he is for us, that they too are created just a smidgen lower than the angels, that the Creator has also put all things under their feet, not just our feet. And we will never be able to see with those eyes until humility is our life practice and belonging is our life passion. Yes, it's not easy. It's not easy to be humble. It's not easy to imagine belonging. It's not easy to be human. For some of us, it is nigh impossible to recognize God's imprint and God's glory in our lives or in the lives of others. We never feel valued, and those around us have made us feel even more valueless. But our value is not determined by others. Our value, thankfully, is determined by God. And God, through the psalmist, says that we are almost like gods. And through the voice of the writer of Hebrews, Jesus says we are his brothers and sisters. Friends, that's the good news. We have been crowned with the Creator's honor and glory. We've been gifted with new life through Jesus Christ. We have no reason to live with hubris because all of that is a gift, unearned but freely given and graciously received. There is nothing we need do. It is what it is. We are beloved by God, and so are they. And they belong to God, and so do we. Thanks be to God.